2,000 years later. 6.5 hours later. A few inches later. Day 2, day 3, day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually, 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
Meanwhile, 2 hours later. 8:01 p.m. the next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later. Later that same evening. Several days later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later. 1 pair of pants later. 8 hours later. 298 frozen patties later. 3 hours later. Epilogue the next day. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. 10 seconds later. 346 minutes later. Much later. 3 days later. Opening night later. 3,000 years later. 1 week later. 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later. 3 days later. 2 hours later. 48 hours later. 8 hours later. The following Thursday. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. Much later. Much later. 7 hours later. Epilogue. Several song-filled hours later. A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 2 hours later. 3 days later. 15 minutes later. Several months later. Thousands of tears later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 2 hours later. Much later. Yesterday. Many hours later. 75 years later. 2 hours later. 1 extremely annoying shift later. 2 very boring minutes later. 3 hours later. 1 winner later. The following day. Meanwhile, later. Just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands, 1 frozen wasteland later. 1 hour later. 5 hours later. 2 days later. Later in the void. Approximately 10 hours later. Early the next morning. 1 shift later. 2 weeks later. 11 minutes later. 5 minutes later. A lot of boring math later. 24 hours later. 1 week later. 1 long angry line later. 72 hours later. 2 hours later. Just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning. Montage. The next morning. Many tic-tacs later. Flashback. End of flashback. The very next evening. 1 hour later. The next day. Later. 4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning. Moments later. More moments later. 1 semester later. Graduation day.
1 hour later.
5 minutes later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. The next morning.